The map ended at the ridge. But the world continued. Daniel held the paper flat against the wind, his thumb tracing a line that did not exist on the terrain before them. Behind him, Maya and Adam stood silent, looking past the edge where the emerald canopy seemed to swallow the horizon. The peaks marked on their parchment were jagged, precise, and entirely absent from the wall of deep, suffocating green that stretched out before them. They were supposed to be standing in a high-altitude pass. Instead, they were facing a dense thicket that felt older than the earth itself. Adam stepped forward, his boot crunching on dry pine needles, and stopped. The silence here was heavy, pressing against their ears like deep water. Daniel looked back at the map, then at the tangled wall of vines and trunks, his brow furrowing as the reality of their isolation settled in. They were off the charts, beyond the reach of any path they had planned. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and something sweet, like rotting fruit. They were not just lost. They were entirely disconnected from the world they had left behind just an hour ago. Zyron moved to the front, his boots sinking into the soft, mossy floor. He braced his feet, gripped his staff, and twisted the top crystal. A faint, rhythmic pulse of light rippled outward, casting long, wavering shadows against the tree trunks. He waited for the telltale shimmer of a magical ward, or the hum of an ancient enchantment. But the light hit the bark and simply died. He tried again, pushing more intent into the wood, his knuckles whitening as he exerted pressure. Still, nothing. Not a spark, not a vibration. The forest absorbed the light as if it were nothing more than a candle in a hurricane. He frowned, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth for any sign of residual energy. He tapped the staff against a gnarled root, but the ground remained dull and unresponsive under his touch. He looked back at the others, his jaw set, and shook his head. The energy he had spent his life tracking was entirely absent from this place. It was not just empty, it was a void. He lowered the staff, the rhythmic pulse flickering out completely, leaving them in the dim, oppressive quiet of the trees. The silence felt deliberate, as if the forest were watching them, waiting for them to take the first step inside. Daniel reached into his pack, his movement slow and deliberate. He pulled out a leather-bound journal, the cover worn smooth by time, the edges frayed and dark. He held it with both hands, careful as he pried the stiff binding open. The pages were yellowed, brittle and cracked under the slightest pressure. He squinted at the faint, handwritten ink, his thumb tracing the jagged lines of a map, sketched in the margins. 1897, he muttered, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the trees. He pointed to a specific entry, the paper quivering as he held it out for the others to see. The text described a village that had simply ceased to exist, vanishing from all records in a single night. According to these notes, the coordinates they were standing on were exactly where that settlement once thrived. Adam stepped closer, looking at the faded sketches of rooftops and chimneys that no longer existed. Daniel turned a page, the dry parchment snapping softly, and confirmed the date again. The evidence was right there in his hands, linking their current location to a century-old disappearance. He tucked the journal back into his pack, his grip tightening, and looked toward the dense wall of trees. They were no longer just lost. They were walking into a historical ghost story. Daniel took the lead, his boots pressing into the boundary line where the sunlight abruptly ended. The transition was sharp. One step was warm, filled with the hum of insects and the heat of the afternoon. The next step was biting. The air temperature plummeted, turning his breath into a thin, white mist that hung before him. He stopped, his shoulders hunching against the sudden, unnatural cold. Behind him, Maya and Adam hesitated, their eyes locked on the dark wall of emerald leaves. Zyron raised his staff, but the wood remained inert, cold as stone in his grip. The forest did not welcome them, it simply existed, indifferent and freezing. Daniel pushed forward, his boots crunching on dry, brittle needles that had not seen a sunbeam in decades. The silence here was different, heavy, thick, and suffocating. It felt as though they were stepping into a room that had been sealed for a century. Adam followed, his hand brushing a low-hanging branch that felt like frozen iron. They moved in single file, their bodies reacting to the abrupt shift in climate. Every muscle tightened, every sense sharpened. The path ahead narrowed, swallowed by the canopy, and the world they had left behind began to feel like a fading memory. Adam was the last to cross, his boots still kicking up dust from the threshold. He paused, feeling a strange vibration beneath his heels, like the earth itself was settling into a new position. He turned back, intending to check their distance from the clearing, but his breath caught in his throat. The trail he had just walked was gone. There was no trampled grass, no broken twigs, no depression in the soil, only an unbroken, dense wall of thorns and ancient, gnarled trunks. "The path is gone," he shouted, his voice cracking as he spun in a full circle. He lunged back toward where the entrance should have been, his fingers scraping against the rough, cold bark of trees that felt like solid stone. He pushed against a branch, but it did not yield. It was part of a seamless, impenetrable barrier. Daniel and Maya turned, their faces pale as they surveyed the wall of vegetation. The ground behind them was as solid and undisturbed as a mountain face. Adam clawed at the dirt, his boots skidding on loose, dry needles as he tried to find a gap, a break, anything. Nothing. The forest had closed behind them, sealing the exit with finality. They were no longer visitors. They were contained. Daniel clicked his flashlight on. The beam sputtered, then punched a narrow, pale cylinder of light into the darkness. It did not travel far. Within 3 feet, the light hit a wall of gray, churning vapor that seemed to solidify upon contact. The fog did not drift. It clung, thick and damp, tasting of wet ash and ozone. He swung the light left, then right, but the beam died against the swirling curtain. It was as if the air itself had become a physical weight. Maya stepped closer, her hand gripping the back of his pack until her knuckles showed white. The fog surged forward, swallowing their boots, then their knees rising to meet their chests. Daniel held the light higher, but the halo of illumination only served to highlight the opacity of the mist. He could no longer see the trees, nor the ground beneath his feet. Every movement felt like wading through deep water. He reached out to grab Adam, but his fingers met only cold, damp air. The world had shrunk to the space between his own shoulders. Disoriented, he took a step forward, his boot sinking into soft, yielding earth, and the light flickered, threatening to vanish entirely into the suffocating white void. The fog thinned as abruptly as it had arrived, dumping them onto a slick, moss-covered bank. The sound hit them first, a low, rhythmic grinding like stones being crushed in a giant mortar. Daniel shone his light toward the noise. A river cut through the center of the clearing, but the water was not following the downward slope of the terrain. It moved against gravity, surging upward toward the jagged mountain peaks, churning violently against the boulders in its path. The current clawed at the rocks, white foam spraying into the air with a metallic tang. Zyron stepped to the very edge, his staff vibrating in his grip. He reached out to touch the surface, but a sudden, icy spray lashed his hand, forcing him to recoil. The water did not ripple. It surged with a rhythmic, pulsing intensity, as if the river possessed a heartbeat of its own. Adam stared at the swirling eddies, his jaw tight. The water defied every law of physics they knew, rushing toward the summit with relentless, impossible force. Maya backed away, the sound of the churning water echoing in her ears like a warning. They stood motionless, watching the liquid climb the mountain, the sheer impossibility of the sight stripping away their last shreds of logical reasoning. The river's roar faded into a dull, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate from the soil itself. Daniel turned his back on the water, scanning the dense growth ahead for any sign of a trail. Everything looked solid, yet the spacing between the trunks felt wrong. He blinked, shaking his head. In the corner of his vision, a massive oak shifted, sliding silently across the forest floor like a piece on a board. He spun around, but the tree stood still, its branches interlocking with its neighbors in a new, tighter pattern. Adam pointed toward a clearing, but as they moved, the path simply folded inward, the trunks knitting together to seal the route. The forest was not merely terrain, it was a mechanism. Zyron gripped his staff, his knuckles strained, as he watched a pine tree glide 3 feet to the left, closing off their only exit. The geometry of the woods was fluid, reacting to their presence with predatory intent. Every time they looked away, the layout altered. erasing their progress and pinning them deeper into the emerald shadows. They were no longer walking through a wilderness. They were being maneuvered through a trap that calculated their movements to keep them contained. The trees groaned, their roots dragging through the dirt, finalizing the new, claustrophobic arrangement of their cage. The grinding sound of wood against soil intensified until the air felt thick with the vibration. Maya stumbled, her balance failing, as the ground beneath her tilted sharply. She reached out, slamming her palms against the rough bark of a massive oak to steady herself. Her breath hitched in her throat. The tree was not stationary. She felt a rhythmic pulse beneath the surface of the bark, a slow, deep thrumming that matched the cadence of her own frantic heart. As she pulled her hands back, the oak groaned, its roots curling deep into the earth like fingers clutching at prey. She watched in silence as the trunk slid an inch to the left, then 2 inches forward, realigning itself to block her view of the others. Adam reached for her, but the space between them widened as the ground itself seemed to expand, stretching the distance. Maya pressed her back against the tree, desperate for a solid anchor, but the wood felt warm and supple, yielding slightly to the pressure of her spine as if it were breathing. She looked up, expecting to see the sky, but the canopy had woven itself into a solid, impenetrable ceiling. Every point of contact, every surface she touched, was shifting, adjusting, and reacting to their presence. The forest was no longer just a location. It was a living, breathing entity that had decided to hold them still. The heavy silence of the closing trees held them immobile until the sound broke it. It started as a faint ripple in the air, a high-pitched, melodic laugh that seemed to vibrate from the very leaves above. Daniel spun, his flashlight beam swinging wildly across the canopy, but there was nothing there. The laugh came again, sharper this time, dancing between the trunks like a taunt. It was fluid, crystalline, and entirely devoid of human warmth. Maya covered her ears, but the sound cut through, insistent and impossible to ignore. As the laughter echoed, the trees that had locked them in place began to groan again. They did not retreat. They pivoted, their branches swinging wide in a rhythmic, mechanical dance. A narrow, dark corridor opened up between the shifting oaks, leading deeper into the suffocating density of the forest. The laugh sounded once more, closer now, echoing from the path ahead. It was a clear, beckoning invitation that demanded movement. Adam took a hesitant step forward, his eyes fixed on the shadows where the sound had originated. Daniel gestured for the others to follow, his jaw set. The forest was hurting them. With the laughter ringing in their ears, they abandoned their defensive stance and stepped into the tunnel of shifting wood, pulled forward by the invisible, mocking force that controlled the labyrinth. The tunnel of shifting timber ended as abruptly as it had begun. The group stumbled forward, their boots hitting flat, compacted earth instead of the undulating forest floor. The melodic laughter cut off instantly, leaving behind a silence so absolute. It felt heavy against their eardrums. Daniel brought his flashlight up, the beam sweeping across the sudden, wide expanse. In the center of the clearing stood a wooden structure. It was sagging, one side tilted at a precarious angle as if the ground beneath it had partially liquefied. The wood was grayed and splintered, showing deep cracks from decades of exposure to the elements. It sat there like a tombstone in a graveyard of trees, motionless while the forest perimeter continued to twitch and groan. Maya stepped toward it, her boots crunching on dry, brittle grass that had not been present in the dense thicket. Adam held his position, his gaze locked on the doorway, which hung open by a single rusted hinge. The cabin was a singular, decaying remnant of a history that should not have survived this place. No birds sang, no wind stirred the air. They stood together at the edge of the clearing, watching the structure for any sign of movement, but the cabin remained as still as a held breath. Daniel pushed the door further. It groaned on its hinges, a harsh, dry sound that echoed into the rafters. They stepped inside, and the temperature dropped. The air here did not circulate. It sat heavy, thick with a scent of wet paper and old, trapped dust. The cabin was a single, cramped room, yet it felt as if it held centuries of silence. Daniel swung his flashlight, the beam catching the walls. They were not bare. Every inch of the interior surface was covered in sepia-toned photographs. They were pinned to the wood with rusted nails, overlapping in erratic overlapping rows. There were hundreds of them. Faces stared back from the paper. Men, women, and children, all caught in moments of frozen daily life. Some were blurred, as if the subjects had moved during a long exposure. Others were crisp, their eyes tracking the light. Maya walked to the nearest wall, her hand hovering just inches from the cracked paper. The images were not random. They were snapshots of a village that should not exist, preserved in a state of decay that defied time. The silence in the room was absolute, a suffocating weight that pressed against their chests. They were standing in a museum of the missing, and every frame seemed to be waiting for a response. Daniel moved deeper into the room, his eyes scanning the chaotic mosaic of faces. He stopped before a section of the wall where the paper had peeled away to reveal rotting timber. One image near the center caught his attention. Pinned at a crooked angle, he reached out, his fingertips brushing the cold, brittle surface. He gripped the edges of the photograph and pulled. The rusted nails screeched against the wood, and the image tore away, carrying a flake of grayed timber with it. His hand trembled as he brought the paper into the direct path of his flashlight. The image was perfectly clear, despite the age of the paper. It showed 4 figures standing in a clearing, framed by the same trees they had passed just minutes ago. The perspective was impossible. It was as if someone had been standing precisely where Daniel now stood, looking back at them through the lens of a camera. He turned the photo toward Maya and Adam. Their eyes widened as they recognized the faces in the frame. They were not villagers from the past. They were themselves. The silence of the cabin sharpened into a jagged, pulsing alarm in the back of his mind. He looked from the paper to the walls, then back to the image, his pulse thumping against his throat. Daniel's thumb traced the bottom edge of the paper, his skin pale against the sepia tone. He pointed to the small, ink-stamped corner. The numbers were stark, biting into the paper. 1897. Adam leaned in, his breath hitching as he read the date aloud. The sound was swallowed by the room. 1897, the year of the vanishing. They stood in a circle of silence, the weight of the information crashing into them with physical force. Maya took a step back, her heel catching on a floorboard. If the village was gone in 1897, and they were in the photo, then the cabin was not just a record. It was a trap. Zyron raised his staff, the crystal at its tip flickering with a dim, dying light, but he did not speak. The math of the situation defied logic, yet the evidence was in Daniel's shaking grip. They were not just lost in a forest. They were drifting through a century-old anchor point. The walls seemed to draw closer, the thousands of faces in the photographs suddenly appearing to lean forward. Every frame, every image, every soul trapped in the paper was a witness to a cycle that had claimed them as well. The air in the cabin grew thin, charged with the static of a timeline folding in on itself. The date stamp on the photograph began to bleed. Daniel watched, paralyzed, as the black ink liquefied, running down the brittle paper in thick, oily rivulets. The figures in the image shifted, their frozen poses twisting into distorted, blurred shapes. He tried to drop the photo, but it felt glued to his palm, the surface growing uncomfortably warm. Around them, the cabin groaned. Dust fell from the ceiling in heavy, gray curtains coating their hair and shoulders. The wooden floorboards beneath their feet vibrated with a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse, as if the entire structure were breathing. Maya clutched the edge of a table, but the wood felt soft, almost pliable, beneath her grip. The walls warped, the sharp angles of the room softening into curves that defied architectural logic. A sharp smell of ozone pierced the stale, enclosed air, drowning out the scent of decay. Then, the photographs on the walls began to peel away in unison, their frames clattering to the floor. The cabin was no longer a stationary point. It was unraveling. The corners of the room began to dissolve into a swirling gray mist, and the light from Daniel's flashlight flickered, struggling to cut through the sudden, thickening gloom. The sanctuary was collapsing. The gray mist swallowed the floorboards, leaving the group standing on shifting, uncertain ground. Daniel backed away, his beams sweeping across the dissolving walls, but the light hit nothing but empty, swirling air. In the furthest corner of the cabin, the darkness refused to dissipate. It did not swirl like the mist, it coalesced. A patch of shadow, deeper and more solid than the gloom surrounding it. began to detach from the wall. It peeled away with a sound like tearing parchment. The group fell silent, their collective breathing hitching as the darkness started to rise. It stretched upward, thickening into a dense, vertical column that defied the physics of the surrounding fog. The shadow began to ripple, the edges blurring and sharpening in turns, until a distinct, human-like shape emerged from the void. It had no features, yet it carried a weight that pressed against their chests. Adam gripped his flashlight, his knuckles white, as the shape took one slow, deliberate step toward them. The air in the room plunged in temperature, turning their breath into short, white plumes. They stood paralyzed, watching the shadow solidify, its presence dominating the center of the dissolving cabin, signaling that the room was no longer theirs. The shadow did not vanish, it refined. The darkness retracted, leaving behind the figure of an old man who seemed to have been carved from the very wood of the cabin. His skin possessed the dry, cracked texture of ancient parchment, pulled tight over bone. He moved with a slow, rhythmic gait that ignored the chaos of the dissolving room. As he stepped into the remaining beam of Daniel's flashlight, the light caught his eyes. Milky, clouded orbs that did not blink, did not focus, and did not acknowledge the fear radiating from the group. He stopped 3 paces away. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against their ears like deep water. Daniel shifted his weight, but his feet felt anchored to the floorboards. The man's chest rose and fell in a shallow, mechanical motion. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and gnarled, pointing toward the center of the group. Every movement felt deliberate, calculated to maximize the pressure of his arrival. The air grew stagnant, thick, with the smell of dry earth and stagnant time. The group stood motionless, unable to retreat, trapped by the unblinking, sightless stare of the man who had stepped out of the void. The old man opened his mouth, and the sound that emerged was not a human voice. It was the dry, rhythmic scrape of dead leaves, skittering across stone. He did not look at any one of them, yet his gaze felt like a physical weight, pressing against their collective resolve. "You have been here before," he rasped. The words hung in the stagnant air, vibrating with a hollow, ancient resonance. Daniel felt his grip on the flashlight loosen, his thumb trembling against the switch. Maya stepped back, her heel catching on a protruding floorboard, but she did not look down. The man's words repeated in the silence, each syllable a confirmation of the impossibility they had been trying to deny. The forest outside seemed to lean closer, its branches pressing against the windows as if listening to the confession. Adam opened his mouth to speak, but no sound escaped. The terror of the truth had drained the air from his lungs. The old man tilted his head at an unnatural angle, his neck muscles corded and taut. He gestured toward the room, his long fingers trembling in the dim light. "The path is a circle," he rasped again, his voice dropping into a low, guttural hum that made the very floorboards beneath them vibrate. They stood trapped in the echo of his words, realizing their journey had not just begun, but had been repeating for a century. Zyron did not wait for the old man to finish. He lunged forward, his boots kicking up dust as he drove the base of his staff into the floorboards. With a violent, rhythmic thud, he squeezed the wood, his knuckles straining, waiting for the familiar surge of heat. He channeled his intent, forcing his will into the crystal perched at the summit of the rod. Nothing. The air did not shimmer. No golden pulse erupted to push back the encroaching shadows. The crystal remained dull, a lifeless shard of glass that felt like ice against his palm. He twisted the staff, striking the floor again, harder this time. The wood groaned under the impact, but the light refused to ignite. Zyron's jaw tightened. He held the staff out, pointing the tip directly at the old man, but the surrounding space remained stubbornly dark. His desperation spiked as he realized the connection was severed, the ancient power drained by the very earth they walked upon. He pulled the staff back, shaking it, but the crystal did not even flicker. The barrier he relied on was gone. They stood in the center of the cabin, exposed to the suffocating silence, completely stripped of their only defense against the encroaching void. The silence in the cabin shattered as the old man turned his back on them. He ignored Zyron's failed display of power entirely. His slow, deliberate movement signaled a shift that made the very atmosphere heavy. He walked to the threshold of the cabin and raised an arm toward the horizon. His fingers pointed into the dense, dark thicket beyond the clearing. A low vibration started deep beneath their feet. It was not a tremor, but a sustained, grinding sound, like tectonic plates grinding against one another. Daniel grabbed Maya's arm, pulling her toward the center of the room as the floorboards began to warp and splinter. The sound escalated, turning from a rumble into a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks. Outside, the earth groaned under a massive, unseen pressure. The noise echoed through the cabin, rattling the photographs on the walls until they fell in a cascade of paper. Dust billowed from the ceiling, choking the air. The ground beneath the cabin pitched upward, tilting the entire structure. Every beam in the cabin shrieked as the foundation failed. The old man stood motionless, his hands still extended, while the earth continued its violent, deep-throated roar, signaling that the ground was no longer solid beneath them. The floor of the cabin gave way with a deafening snap. Thick, gnarled roots burst through the soil, splintering the wooden beams like matchsticks. Daniel shoved Adam toward the opening as the walls buckled inward. They scrambled over the debris, boots slipping on dirt that was now shifting like a liquid. A massive root, thick as a tree trunk, tore through the clearing, spraying rocks and earth into the air. It carved a deep, jagged trench through the center of the camp. The ground lurched again, throwing Maya to her knees. She grabbed a protruding root to steady herself, her fingers digging into the rough bark. Daniel reached back, hauled her up by the arm, and pointed toward the opening gap in the canopy. They ran. The forest floor was no longer static. It bucked and heaved, rising in waves as more roots erupted from the dark soil. Branches whipped overhead, lashing out at them as they sprinted through the debris. They leaped over a widening fissure, barely clearing the edge before the ground collapsed into the dark void beneath. The old man stood silent amidst the wreckage, watching them vanish into the thicket as the earth continued to tear itself apart, creating a path where no trail had existed before. The ground stopped its violent heaving, settling into a low, pulsating thrum that rattled their teeth. Daniel skidded to a halt, his chest heaving as he scanned the shifting wall of trees. He pushed Maya and Adam behind his frame, his knuckles white as he tightened his grip on the flashlight. The beam cut through the swirling dust, illuminating nothing but twisted trunks and tangled shadows. Adam leaned against a rock, his breath ragged, but Daniel kept his eyes fixed forward. He did not look back. He did not let his arm drop. Every muscle in his shoulders remained locked, creating a human barrier between his family and the encroaching chaos. The forest groaned, a deep, metallic sound that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Daniel took a step forward, his boots crunching on broken twigs. He moved with a heavy, deliberate pace, forcing the others to follow in his wake. He kept the light steady, swinging it in wide arcs to track the movement of the branches. There was no room for hesitation. Only the next step. He gritted his teeth, his jaw set hard, and pressed deeper into the tangled maze. Ignoring the stinging scratches on his arms, as he shoved aside a heavy vine-covered branch to clear the way, the thicket suddenly broke. Daniel stepped through the final wall of vines and stumbled onto flat, packed earth. The others followed, their boots making no sound on the strangely smooth ground. Ahead, the forest did not just stop. It bowed. Every trunk, every branch, and every twisted root angled away from the center of the clearing. In the middle stood the tree. It rose like a pillar of stone and bark, its base wider than a house. The canopy above was gone, replaced by the height of the trunk as it pierced the sky. Daniel killed the flashlight. It was useless here. The tree radiated a dull, rhythmic light that washed over the clearing in slow, pulsing waves. Adam reached out to touch the air, his hand stopping inches from the bark. The air felt heavy, charged with static that made the hair on their arms stand upright. Zyron stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the immense, gnarled roots that coiled into the earth like sleeping serpents. The ground beneath them started to hum. It was a low, structural vibration that traveled up through the soles of their boots and settled in their chests. They were no longer in the forest. They were at its heart. Daniel walked a slow circle around the base of the massive trunk. Above him, the bark was not bare. Clustered along the lower branches were hundreds of spheres, each the size of a human head. They pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent glow that shifted between pale blue and amber. He reached up, his hand hovering just inches from the nearest orb. The light inside seemed to swirl like trapped smoke. Zyron pushed past him, his fingers twitching as he reached for his staff to test the energy. He tapped the wood against the base of the tree, but the staff remained inert. No resonance, no spark. The magic here was not of his world. Maya stepped closer, her eyes locked on the sphere nearest her shoulder. It was vibrating, a faint, rhythmic thrumming that matched the pulse of the forest floor. She leaned in, her nose inches from the glass-like surface of the orb. Within the glow, she saw the faint, flickering outline of a human hand. Then, another. The spheres were not just light. They were containers. Hundreds of them hung from the boughs, swaying in a wind that did not reach the ground. They were breathing in unison, a collective, stored breath of a century. Maya squinted, her breath fogging the surface of the nearest sphere. The interior cleared. It was a sun-drenched town square, frozen in the amber light. A woman walked across the frame, carrying a basket of grain. She reached the center, turned, and walked back to the start. Over and over. Maya watched the woman's feet, the repetitive scuff of leather against dust. It was a perfect, endless loop. Daniel stepped in, his face inches from the glass. He saw a man leaning against a post, reading a letter. The man folded the paper, unfolded it, and read it again. The sequence lasted exactly 10 seconds before resetting. Adam pointed to a group of children playing near a fountain. They were frozen in a mid-air leap, their laughter silenced by the glass. The villagers were not just captured. They were trapped in the final, mundane moments of their existence. Every gesture was a ghost of a life that refused to end. Daniel felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine as the woman in the orb stopped her pacing. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto his. She looked expectant, as if waiting for him to join the cycle. He stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The loop continued, indifferent and absolute. Daniel could not look away. The woman in the orb seemed to be reaching out, her fingers pressing against the inside of the glass. Zyron shouted something, a warning about corrupted energy, but the sound was muffled, as if coming from underwater. Daniel ignored him. He needed to know if it was real. He raised his hand, his trembling fingertips extending toward the rough, ancient bark of the tree. The surface was unexpectedly warm, humming with a low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth. The moment his skin made contact, the forest screamed. It was not a sound of wind or wood, but a deep, grinding groan that tore up through the soles of his boots. The earth beneath them buckled. A fissure opened near Adam's feet, spraying dark soil into the air. The tree itself seemed to inhale. The bioluminescent orbs flared with a blinding, white-hot intensity, then went pitch black. Daniel tried to pull his hand away, but the bark had turned tacky, gripping his fingers like wet clay. The ground pitched sideways, forcing everyone to their knees. Something shifted deep within the roots, a massive, hidden weight finally waking from a long, hollow sleep. The ground stopped its violent heaving, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. Then, the air itself began to vibrate. It started as a low, subsonic hum that settled in their marrow, then solidified into a sound that felt like boulders grinding together deep beneath the crust. "You found the village." The voice boomed. It did not come from a single direction. It emanated from the soil, the branches, and the very air they breathed. The tone was ancient, devoid of human warmth, and heavy with the weight of centuries. Daniel scrambled to his feet, pulling Maya and Adam toward the center, but the forest responded instantly. Massive branches swung inward with a sickening, wet crack, weaving together into an impenetrable wooden cage. The sky was blotted out as the canopy sealed itself shut. "You have not found the one who controls me." The voice continued, the sound causing the remaining orbs to pulse in jagged, rhythmic flashes. Zyron struck his staff against the ground, but the wood shattered under the pressure of the surrounding energy. They were no longer explorers. They were specimens in a box. The walls of the cage continued to tighten, leaves and thorns scraping against the encroaching wood until there was nowhere left to turn. The cage walls pulsed with a rhythmic, organic heat. Adam pressed his hands against the interlocking branches, but they were as hard as iron. Above them, the canopy remained a solid, impenetrable ceiling of black. Then, the darkness began to dilate. A faint, pale light flickered from the very top of the cage, casting long, frantic shadows across the forest floor. The group looked up, necks straining against the oppressive weight of the air. High above, the shifting leaves parted like curtains. Two colossal spheres, each the size of a mountain lake, blinked open. They burned with a cold, ancient fire that bled into the dark, illuminating the true scale of their prison. These were not just branches and leaves, they were the eyelashes of a titan. The eyes locked onto them, glowing with a predatory, unblinking intensity that made the ground beneath their feet feel like thin, fragile skin. Every tree, every vine, every root was merely a nerve ending, connected to the massive, waking consciousness now staring down at them. The scale of the monster was absolute. There was no horizon, no exit, and no hope of concealment. The forest was not a place. It was a creature, and it had finally noticed them. The gaze from above was heavy, a physical weight that pressed them into the dirt. Zyron stared up at the burning spheres, his fingers trembling against the wood of his staff. He tapped the crystal one last time, but it remained dark, dead weight in his hand. He let it slip from his grip. It hit the forest floor with a dull thud. Forgotten. Run, he rasped, the word barely audible against the growing pressure. The ground beneath them shuddered, not from an earthquake, but from a sound building in the depths of the canopy. It started as a low, guttural vibration that rattled their teeth, then exploded into a roar that tore through the air. It was a sound of ancient hunger, a deafening blast that shredded the remaining silence of the woods. Leaves were ripped from the branches by the force of the noise. The wind, generated by the roar, knocked Maya off balance, forcing her to scramble toward the thicket. Daniel grabbed Adam by the shoulder, shoving him forward as the earth began to tilt. The entire clearing seemed to rise up to meet them. Every trunk, every vine, and every root moved in violent, frantic synchronicity. There was no time to look back. They turned and sprinted into the dark, lungs burning as the forest roared again, echoing behind them like a closing trap. They did not stop running. Every breath was a jagged tear in the cold, still air. Daniel led, his flashlight beam swinging wildly across the rapidly shifting landscape. Behind them, the roar faded into a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Then, the path ahead vanished. A wall of trunks slammed shut, blocking their only exit. Maya skidded to a halt, hands outstretched, fingers scraping against the rough, impenetrable bark. Adam dived toward a narrow gap, but the branches lashed out like whips, weaving together in a frantic, seamless weave of wood and vine. The sky above disappeared as the canopy folded inward, interlocking its jagged limbs into a thick, ceiling-high dome. They were boxed in. The cabin they had left behind was now hidden, buried under a shifting mountain of roots. Daniel turned, light shaking in his grip, illuminating the walls of their prison. The wood was alive, pulses of bioluminescent light rippling through the surface like blood under skin. There was no sound now, only the slow, steady hum of the cage tightening around them. They stood back to back, the circle of light from the flashlight shrinking as the trees crowded closer, sealing the last of the darkness into their final silent hold.